very last day of July. It is almost August, and Fan Expo Toronto is in like a month. I'm starting a new job next week, and my friend and I want to go, and I said I would make her a Nifty. So let's get to it, shall we? Because the convention was coming up fast, we did Nifty as quickly as possible, and I took a couple shortcuts. To figure out the size of the hooping on the bottom of the hoop skirt, all I did was take a piece of my hooping, put it together, and went, yeah, that looks right. I took the measurement from the waist to the knee as my length, and then I just made a circle skirt. I measured along the folded edge the knee to waist length, because that was going to be the length of the petticoat. Then I did a half circle in the center, well, 3/4 of a circle really, and I took my measuring tape and measured along that shape and measured out half of the waist measurement. So that inner part of the circle is going to be the waist, and this is half of our 3/4 skirt. I measured out that waist to knee measurement in a bunch of different spots just perpendicular to that inner circle. Then I connected all those spots, and that was my hem. To cut this out, I gave myself seam allowance on all of the edges just so I could actually sew it. Then I just quickly marked a line at the halfway point on both sides of the hoop skirt, halfway down that is, because I knew I wanted to put 2 rings of hooping in it. And I just cut the exact same thing out a second time as the pattern for the skirt. This was me being as fast as possible, so. And we're going to go through the bodice block really fast. I make these all the time. You can see it in other tutorials for more in depth. But basically, towards the back with the selvage is going to be the back, and then the front is on the fold. I mark along the shoulder line my center neck to neck point and then shoulder point. I go up 1/8 of an inch at the neck point, down 1/8 of an inch at the shoulder point to get the slope. Mark down my neck amounts on both sides, and then I mark down my bust and weight measurements, specifically the vertical measurements. Then I go through and go with my bust measurement and do my front bust mark and my back bust. Then I do half of the waist on both. Now, the amount was too big of a difference between the front bust and the front waist, so I did end up putting a dart in which I just added 1 inch on the bottom of the waist measurement and then drew in my dart. I measured up about 2 inches on the side seam, and then made that my underarm point. Then I just made a J shape with a right angle at the shoulder and underneath the underarm. Then I just added seam allowance and cut everything out. Next was the sleeves, which had a tiny bit of trial and error. So I measured out the bicep amount, and then I measured the sleeve cap. I usually do about 8 inches just to be safe. And then I made it into kind of a bell shape. Now the front and back were the measurements of the J from the bodice block plus 1 inch. To me, this makes it a lot easier, and then I'll just make adjustments during the fitting. Then I did the exact same thing, but I doubled my bicep measurement, which meant I knew that the bell was going to be a lot bigger, which was completely fine. I did make it taller as well, just by like 1 inch or 2, just to give a little extra for the gathering. Then I cut out that initial shape, tried it on myself. My friend and I are very similar sizes. It was way too tight, so I ended up opening it, slashing it open, keeping the hem together, and just giving myself more space at the top. And I liked how that fit. And then I cut everything out with adding seam allowance. And then the last little bit, I just cut out 2 long pieces, one for the bottom of the hoop skirt to make a casing for the hooping, and one for the top of the hoop skirt to make a casing for the waist drawstring. Now, unfortunately, I cannot find the footage of me sewing this together anyways, so I'm just gonna very quickly walk you through how I sewed it together. Basically, I sewed the side seam of the circle skirt together, added a casing at the bottom and the midway point and the top, put a drawstring through the top, and my hooping through the midway point and the bottom. And that was done. Then also for the bodice, I sewed the shoulder seams together. Then I immediately inset the sleeves. I find it easier to do when it's all open. And to do that, I gathered my bigger sleeve onto my smaller sleeve and then sewed from the shoulder point down to the armpit on both sides. Then I attached the side seams together from the armpit to the bottom of the sleeve, and then from the armpit to the bottom of the bodice. Then I attached my skirt to my bodice, making sure that the front and center was connected all the way through. And the last piece was I put a zipper in the center back, all the way from the top at the neck, through the waist into the bottom, and then what was left of the bottom of the skirt I just attached together. And it was ready for fitting, which I also don't have footage of because I ran over to her house without any of my filming equipment because we were doing this so fast. But you'll see all the alterations as we cut each piece out. The only alteration from the fitting on the hoop skirt was the fact that we needed to take in the hoop just a little on the bottom to get the right shape, which meant that the pattern was perfect. So I ended up using a dark maroon color because that's the color of under Nifty's skirt. I took out all of my hooping, cut my hoop to the actual length that I wanted, and then I transferred the pattern directly over to the new fabric. Then I cut out a bunch of strips. I think I ended up needing 6 or 7. I figured out how many strips would cover the entire bottom all the way around and that midline point all the way around. And I cut that many strips. It was the width of my hooping plus a ½ inch on either side for seam allowance. I did the same for the waistband, measuring the drawstring I was going to use. To sew the hoop skirt, the first thing I did was close that big seam at the back, but only halfway on the bottom half. To do this, I did a French seam, which meant that I put bad side to bad side together, stitched it down that halfway, trimmed my seam allowance, then flipped it again so it was right side to right side, and sewed it again so that I enclosed all of the seam allowance from the last seam in the new seam. So there were no raw edges on any part of the skirt. I also took a moment and the top half of that seam I just folded twice and stitched down to give it a nice finished edge. Sewing the waistband was next, and I took one of the strips and lined up the edge of it with the edge of the waistband, wrong side to wrong side, and stitched all the way down, lining up those two edges. Then I flipped the waistband up and away from the rest of the skirt, folded it in half. Now it was on the good side, and the little bit of seam allowance on top I folded under and stitched down. This created a casing that I could put the drawstring through. The next step was the middle part of the boning, and this was honestly the easiest step. Just along that line, I placed my long strips after I had sewn enough together, and I folded under one edge, top stitched that edge all the way around, and then went back and did the same thing on the other end. Folded it under and stitched it all the way around, making sure that I left enough space in the middle for the boning, and also making sure that I left it open at the end so I could get the boning in. To sew the bottom casing together, I first stitched all my pieces of fabric of tubing together. Then I lined them up wrong side to wrong side with the cut edge together and stitched all the way around the entire skirt. Then I flipped that, much like we did with the waistband, but this time up and over so that that seam became the new bottom edge. This meant I could fold that top edge up and stitch it down, and it would give me enough space to put the boning in to that hole I was just creating, that tunnel. It did take some time, and I had to put a couple tiny little darts in at the top edge, because the top edge, of course, is not as wide as the bottom edge because it is a circle, but that was pretty simple to do. And then finally, I just fed in all of my hooping and also my waistband. Now, I left the hooping areas open because I specifically wanted to be able to adjust the size or take the hooping out so that I could wash the hoop skirt. I just used tape to close the hoop skirt, and that worked really well for me. Now it's time to make the petticoat, which is arguably very time consuming, but quite simple. It does require math. So what I did was I measured from the waistband of the hoop skirt to the hem of the hoop skirt and added an inch to figure out the length that I wanted each piece. I divided that by 3, and that became the height of the 3 tiers that we were going to be sewing. Now I say height, remember that for each of these you want to add half an inch to an inch depending on if there's something being sewn on the top or bottom. Then what I did is I figured out double the waist measurement, and that was the length of my top tier. Now I did double the waist measurement because it was more than the measurement of the hips. If it's less, you want to do at least the hip measurement so you can get it on. The second tier is 2 pieces of fabric that are double the length of the top tier. The third tier is 4 lengths of fabric that are double the length of the second tier. So basically you start with 1, then you go to 2, then you go to 4, and you double each time. I figured out how wide my fabric was, and that let me know how many strips I needed for each tier. So for example, if I had a 30-inch waist, my top tier would be 60 inches, so it was 1 strip. My second tier would be 120 inches, and I'd need 2 of those. So that meant that I would cut 2 strips for 2A and 2 strips for 2B. My third tier would be double even that. So it'd be 4 strips for 3A, 4 strips for 3B, 4 strips for 3C, and 4 strips for 3D. It becomes a lot, but it does make sense when you start sewing it all together. I kept all of my tiers in their different piles so I knew which was which. You can see me sorting them all out here. I always like to start on the bottommost tiers and work my way up. It is easier to do, trust me. So I started off with my 4 piles for the third tier, and each pile got sewn into one very long strip. All I did was lay the tulle on top of itself at the end and stitch it down. Then, this is the fun part, I took a thick thread, I have a waxed cord I like to use, tied a knot in the end, and made sure that that thread was at least as long as my second tier, plus about 4 to 5 inches. This meant that I could now zigzag over top of the cord, not on the cord, over the cord on either side as I went, and I could pull the cord to gather the material. I repeated this on each strip, so I had 4 gathered strips. It is fun to pull the cord, I will be honest. You can use like a buttonhole thread, you just want something that's not going to snap when you tug on it. Then I took 2 of my bottom tier 3 pieces and sewed them onto the bottom of one of my tier 2 pieces. So you can see I just kind of adjusted the gathering as I went, but if you're new to this, the best way to do it is lay out your piece of 2, your tier 2 piece, pin your 2 tier 3 pieces at either side and in the middle, and then even out the gathering so that it looks right. It's not all gathered on one side. And I sewed those 2 to tier 2, and I did that twice. So now I had 2 tier 2 pieces, and each one had 2 tier 3 pieces on the bottom. Are you with me so far? Now I started running a little low on time. So to gather tier 2, I did my 2 pieces together as one. And once again, I took a long piece of thread that was equal to the length of tier 1 this time and zigzagged on top of it so I could gather it. And that meant that I had my 2 tier 2 pieces together, and then I could stitch them to the bottom of my tier 1 piece. The last bit of gathering for this, I know it's very time consuming, was to gather the top of tier 1 into the waist measurement. So this meant that I took my thread and made sure that thread was equal to my waist measurement, tied a knot at the end, and stitched over top of it with a zigzag all the way through. It was pretty straightforward and pretty fast compared to all the other layers. And then we attached a waistband just like we did for the hoop skirt, where I lined up that gathered edge at the top with the edge of just a strip of black material that I had. Sewed it all the way across. Then I flipped the black material up, folded it in half, and then that bottom seam allowance I tucked up that we had already sewn, and also tucked the other side under and in to enclose all the seam allowance, and stitched along that fold on the front all the way down to give a nice finished edge. And then I just used a safety pin to feed a drawstring all the way through. And the very last thing to do was close up the back end. So I made sure I tied the waistband together, made sure everything was lying front, and then starting about 2 inches down, I just stitched the tulle layers together, matching them up as I went. Whenever I do fittings, I take my pins and my markers and I just kind of pin it as I need it to be, and then I come back later and make sure those marks are on my pattern pieces and adjust everything. So as you can see, I ended up taking the skirt in a bit so it wasn't quite as full on top. And I had pinned the darts while it was on her, just a little bit more than they actually had initially been drafted. So I took those in and marked them, made sure that they were the same side to side. Then I decided that I didn't need the whole thing, I would just take half and place it on the fold when I cut it out, so I marked it accordingly. The next step was ripping the sleeve out. Because everything was basted, this was super easy to do. And we had decided that the sleeve on top, because we did the inner sleeve and the over sleeve, needed to be bigger and poofier, so I cut it in half so that when I laid it out on my actual fabric, I could put some extra fabric in there. The final adjustment that we had to do was take in the shoulders just a little bit towards the neck. Everything was fine at the shoulder point, but the neck point needed to be brought in just a little bit. And I did that on the front and back, cut it out, took my dart apart, and it was good to cut out my actual fabric. Woohoo! The shirt pieces were cut out on white fabric. We used something with a little bit of stretch, but not too much, and I doubled the fabric up because I did not want it to be see-through. We cut the front on fold, well, folded it out and cut it twice, so that there was no seam, and cut the back with a seam down the center back because we were going to put a zipper in. There was a slight stumbling block with cutting out the skirt in that the mock-up fabric was wider than the actual fabric, so what I ended up doing was seeing where the side seam was at the waist, which I used the front bodice piece to figure out, and then also seeing where the halfway point on the bottom would be, and making that a seam line so that there were side seams on the skirt now where there wasn't on the mock-up. This meant that from front on, it was still very clean, there was no seam right down the center, and I could just piece it together as you can see here. And then it was time to cut out the sleeves. This was super simple. I laid out my pattern pieces, giving a couple of inches in between the new wider top poofy sleeve. And just cut them out. And then I realized that there was actually enough fabric left to put pockets in these new side seams, so clearly I had to do that. I just traced out a bit of the side piece, including the waist, so I knew exactly what it looked like. And then I made sure that my hand could fit in the slash amount. I used my phone as a size guide. Her phone is about the same size as mine. And made sure it was a phone width deep. Made a mark on the skirt where the hand amount went down. Lined it up with the side seam all the way down. Cut my notches for that hand amount. And cut out 4 of them, 2 for each pocket. Pretty straightforward. At the sewing machine, the first thing I did was work on the poofy sleeves. And I had made a mark where the original sleeve ended, where I added that amount in. And I made that a curved dart on the top and bottom so that it was quite exaggerated in the end. So I sewed that first on both sleeves. Next, I ran a quick basting stitch along the top third of the top of that big sleeve and the entire bottom of the sleeve. Then I gathered in the bottom of the sleeve so that it equaled the same distance as the undersleeve, the one that fit close to the body, and then sewed them together, right side to right side. I ran a quick line of top stitching to push all my seam allowance to the inner side of the sleeve, that like tighter non-gathered side. Then I laid it out so that my side seams were facing each other. This meant that it went from the flat sleeve through that seam where they were sewn together into the gathered sleeve, and I sewed that seam as one so that when you put the poof on the outside and you had your inner sleeve on the inside, there was no raw edges whatsoever, so you couldn't see it in the underarm, just to keep it really nice and clean. Then I gathered the top bell of the sleeve that we had basted and pinned it to the flatter sleeve underneath so that it equaled that amount all in the top, and basted it together. So then I had one sleeve, then I repeated all of those steps on the second sleeve. Then I switched over to my serger. I did this because I had it, it was working, it was easy. You can just use a regular machine as well. The first thing I did was stitch the inside edge and the bottom edge of the pockets together so that I had two separate pockets. I left the outside edge where it attached to the skirt separate, and I didn't do the top either at this point. Then I opened the pocket and put the inside edge of the pocket to the right side of the skirt at the side seam and sewed down from the top to that notch of where the hand goes in. I did this on both sides, and it was the inside of the pocket to the front of the skirt so that when you fold it in, it lays nicely. I did this on both sides. Then I made sure the pocket was folded to the inside, and I laid down the top and sewed along the top. This made sure that everything held together. So it gave me a nice finished edge where my hand goes in, and it made sure the pocket was folded towards the front in the end. Now you can see that when it's laid nicely, the back of the inside of the pocket becomes the top of the side seam, and we attach that to the back of the skirt. And then where the notch is at the end of the hand, we will have the two sides of the pocket, the front of the skirt, and the back of the skirt, and we sew that all together just as if it's a normal side seam. Do that for both sides, and you've almost got a skirt now. The very last bit was sewing down the center back seam. I went down a couple of inches so that I would leave space for the zipper, and just did it from there to the end. When sewing the top, I made sure to separate the front two pieces so that I could enclose all the seam allowances inside those two pieces. So although they were cut the same, one acted as a lining basically. And the very first step I did was sew the darts in for both of the front pieces. The next step was sewing the front bodice to the back of the bodice at the shoulder seams. And I did triple check to make sure my back pieces were laying correctly and that the necks matched and the shoulder seams matched, because I have done that before. Then I showed the shoulder seams of the lining piece as well. The next step was taking my good piece of the fashion fabric, whichever one I thought looked best, and insetting the sleeves. And to do that, I just matched them at the shoulder seam, which was the center of my gathered sleeve, and the underarm, and then worked them in together to be the same. And then I just sewed them all around, which I feel is always faster on the second shoulder. So the next step was attaching the good bodice to the skirt, and I made sure they were right side to right side. I just started at the back seam and made sure that all my seams lined up as I sewed along. So I made sure that my side seams lined up and my center front marks lined up. You can pin it ahead of time. I just went with the flow. For the lining piece of the bodice, I made sure that it was right side down, facing the wrong side of the skirt, and that I could see the wrong side of the shirt on top. So basically the wrong sides of both of the bodice pieces were facing out, and I sewed it all along that seam again so that afterwards when I folded them up together, all my raw edges and seams were sandwiched between the two of them. And this one's hard to explain, but I put the lining material folded in at the underarm, went between the two layers and pinched the seam allowance of both the lining, the sleeve, and the front of the bodice, then pulled it out and stitched all the way around that so that I could flip it right side out the other way. You can also, if you don't understand that, which is totally fair and hard to explain, you can just stitch the lining at the armhole by hand. You just turn under a little bit and stitch it in. I did it for both sleeves, but it is easier to do it by hand if you don't have a lot of experience. To finish the neck, I did something very similar, but it was a lot easier. I put the necks together, folded them in properly, and then pinched the seam allowance from the inside. Then I moved the rest of the dress out of the way, and from that center point stitched all the way down one side. Then I folded it normally again, pinched from the other side, flipped it inside out, and sewed all the way around the neck the other way. Because I left the back seam open, I was able to get into the back and finish off the neck from that way. And all that left was the center back zipper, which I don't have footage of, and the hem, which I also don't have footage of. These are really straightforward. For the center back zipper, I just basted it closed. Then I centered the zipper underneath and top stitched around the zipper on top of the fabric. I did switch the colors of my thread halfway through so that the bodice part would be white and the skirt part would be the red. And for the hem of the dress, I did let it sit as long as I could. You want to let it sit at least 24 hours. Then I had her try everything on, hemmed it, like marked it where I wanted it to be, added an inch of hem allowance, folded it a half inch again, and stitched it all the way around. Super straightforward. It doesn't have to be the full half inch. Sometimes that's hard on a curve. You can do less if that makes more sense to you. For Nifty's apron, I actually used the skirt mock-up piece and drew it on top of that, looking at my reference picture to kind of get an idea of the scale. I drew the inner part and then just drew a quick version of the scallops on it. Then I cut it out extra wide and held it up to myself to make sure that it looked right scale-wise. Once I knew I liked the size, I realized I had to take it in a little at the top. That was pretty easy. Then I drew the inner part of the apron and made sure that that was the same side to side, like very symmetrical. Then, with some quick math, I just made sure that the scallops started larger and went smaller as they went, making sure there was an appropriate number. I drew them on half, and then I copied that to the other side so that I wasn't having to try and do it again from scratch. I cut it up once on the fold, and that was going to be my lining piece, as it were, much like we did with the bodice. And then I cut it out double, not on the fold. Because my white was fairly thin and it was going on top of the red, I wanted to make sure beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was not going to be see-through. The two pieces that I cut flat, I did just treat as a single piece when sewing everything together, however. I also did not cut out the scallops at this point in time. I cut a little outside of the scallops to make sure that when I sewed the scallops together, they were as perfect as possible and weren't stretching out. And last but not least, I took my black material, I just used a spandex, and cut 2 long lengths. Now I wanted it to end up being about an inch at the waist in total, so I did 2 inches so it could fold over, plus a 1/2 inch on each side for seam allowance. So it was 3 inches wide, and I cut that twice the full width of my black fabric. To sew the apron, I actually trimmed off the seam allowance on my pattern piece so that I could leave the pattern piece on the actual fabric and stitch just past the fabric of the pattern piece, which meant that I could get everything symmetrical, it didn't stretch out, and it stayed exactly where I needed it to be. It was time consuming, but I just went all the way around following those scallops, and I had all 3 pieces of fabric together. The next step was trimming all of the seams and clipping them all. So that means making little snips all the way around where you've sewn, right to but not through the stitching line, or like a millimeter or 2 away from the stitching line. This means that when you fold it right side out, it'll actually allow it to curve properly. If you don't put the little clips in around those curves especially, it won't sit right when you flip it right side out. Which was the next step, I flipped it right side out. After everything was flipped the right side out, I actually went through and top stitched around that inner loop, just inside from the scallops. And as I did it, I made sure that the scallops were laying flat and everything was pulled out properly. I did actually press this, just not on camera. Then I took my black material, I sewed it together so it became one long strip instead of 2, and then I placed that seam on the center top of the apron, good side to good side, and stitched it where it attached to the apron, just on one side of the black. I flipped the black up so it was away from the white, and then folded it in half towards the back of the white, with enough overlap that I knew I could come back, fold it under, and stitch it down. But instead of doing that right away, I actually sewed down the side while it was folded in half to create a little tube. At the end, I sewed back up on an angle so that it would be like a nice pointed end for the bow. I did the same thing on the other side, making sure it was still folded nicely all the way across, and just stitched all the way down. Now, I also trimmed the edges after I sewed it down, and I made sure to flip it right side out when I was done. And the very last step was I folded all my seam allowance of the apron up, and then I folded down the black and tucked in the seam allowance of that as well, making sure that on the back side, that little fold went just past my seam line. Then I went back to the right side of the fabric and stitched that down along the edge of the black, right where it meets the white, making sure that I caught it underneath, and that closed out the waistband. And then the apron was done. Now the bloomers, I only have footage of cutting it, so I'll just walk through it quickly. This is completely optional. We just wanted to have it match the hoop skirt. You could also just wear like black bicycle shorts that match the tights. I won't go into too much detail about how to make a pattern for shorts because we've covered it on almost every other tutorial. But basically you can follow that, but you add a little bit of extra width around and a little bit of extra height so that it can balloon properly when it's all sewn. I like to put an elastic at the waistband, and I put an elastic on each thigh so that it would have that nice gathered look. The gloves were done really quickly with the kind of sandwich method, where you literally trace your hand onto 2 pieces of spandex together and then sew along that trace, try it on, make adjustments. The big secret is there's a seam on the inside of the wrist that overlaps, so that she can get her hand out and have access to her fingers without having to take the whole thing off, because it's actually a bolero. The gloves are literally attached at the shoulder to the bolero under the dress. For the scarf, it was a tube that was twice around her neck and then double knotted. I figured out how long that needed to be, and then I cut a strip that was the height I wanted times 2 plus seam allowance, and then sewed it into a tube. Super straightforward.